Okay, so now let's have a look at the last dimension of this lesson about colonialism for France and Britain. And after speaking about the conquest and then the propaganda that allowed the spreading of the colonial doctrine, it's now time to have a closer look on what colonial societies really were and how they functioned. The first point will be about the question of governance, which was marked by a certain diversity in both the French and the British empires. But we can also see some common points. So, the administration of colonies was quite diverse, and one of the first type of administration that could be put in place was protectorates. The protectorates, which were administered from the metropole, from Britain or from France, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, were colonies where the control of the European power was rather low, and a certain autonomy was given to the country, which in fact remained ruled by its local administration, but the leaders had to be loyal to the European power. Southern Nigeria for Britain, or Tunisia or Morocco for France are good examples of this. And you can see on these documents that local leaders, here in the governor of Lagos or the Rai of Tunis, were closely associated to European power, and most of what they had to do was to keep a certain loyalty. From a general point of view, the protectorates are the best example of the strategy of indirect rule. That is a very important expression, indirect rule, which means that often a large range of powers were left to local elites. For example, to many princes in India, and all they had to do was to remain loyal to Britain or to France. What was the reason why the indirect rule was often the norm? Well, the most important reason is that it was the cheapest strategy. Empire had to remain something economically profitable and also something doable, feasible, and total control from the Europeans was just not possible. Moreover, it was important for the European power to keep a certain type of good relationship with the native elites, because it was known that if a rebellion should start off, it would come from the elites, from the educated ones, from the people that used to have power and were deprived of it. So protectorates, and from a general point of view, indirect rule was the best way to act on that matter. Some colonies had a greater control from the European power. In Britain, they were called crown colonies and simply colonies in France. And so they were dealt with by the Ministry of Colonies in both France and Britain, except for the fact that in Britain it was named the Colonial Office, just like Ministry of Foreign Affairs should be called Foreign Office. Examples would be, well, just one example for Britain, Kenya, but we could speak about many, many other areas, or Indochina for France. I would like to point that there was one exception in the British Empire, and this exception was the very specific case of India, where the official name of this political creation was British Raj, British rule. And India was of course specific because of its incredible economic and demographic and symbolic weight. That was a gigantic colony, in fact a subcontinent. All of India was not directly administered by the British. Some areas were administered by local princes, Maharajas, and at the head of British India, a a governor named by the Queen was given the title of Viceroy, which shows how important India was for the British Empire. And now we need to have a close look on the specific case of the colonies of white settlements, because so far the colonies I was speaking about, protectorate colonies, were what French historians call colonies d'exploitation, which means that the presence of the Europeans was very limited in terms of number of people and in terms of share of people. And the activity of the colony was mostly to provide the metropole with products. Colonies of white settlement were colonies where an immigration of European population had been encouraged. And on that specific case, the situation differed a lot between the French and the British model of colonialism. Indeed, in Britain, the strategy which was chosen was a strategy of progressive shift to self-government. And so progressively, most of the colonies of white settlement, the first one being Canada or Australia, they were given the status of dominion, which in fact meant that they stayed in the British Empire but could be self-governed, do their own elections and choose their own government as long as they remained loyal to Britain. And so Canada was the first. It became a dominion in 1867, and a bit later, in the early 20th century, it would be the case of Australia, later New Zealand, or South Africa. South Africa being a very specific case because, contrary to Australia or Canada, here the natives outnumbered the Europeans, which was the contrary in all the other dominions of Britain. The French case is very different because there was, in fact, one important colony of white settlement for France, and that was Algeria. And the choice that was made for Algeria was to turn it into 3 French departments. Okay, so Algeria was composed of 3 departments, just like Limousin, in fact. So officially, the strategy was really to integrate deeply Algeria into the French state. It did not happen because in the end Algeria became independent, but that was the plan, even though at that moment, as we will see later, of course the equality between the different people living in Algeria was just a myth. It was absolutely not a reality. And so the French departments of Algeria were administered not by the colonial office, but by the office of Home Affairs, so in French, Ministère de l'Intérieur. Okay. And in Algeria, even though it was a colony of white settlement, the Europeans were a minority. When World War I started, there were a bit less than 1 million Europeans, 800,000, facing 5.6 million Muslims, because that was the term used to distinguish Europeans from the natives by the French authorities. And so a couple of illustrations of this. Here is a dollar, a Canadian dollar, which illustrates the fact that Canada could print its own money and not use the British pound. So that's a proof of great level of autonomy. And the illustration here is a book from 1893, which was aiming to promote the emigration of French people to Algeria in order to become colonists and and succeed economically in Algeria in the sector of farming in particular. So I already started to mention that, but on the ground, in all these colonies, the situation, despite a couple of variations, was always based on the same pattern. And that pattern was that society was dual and unfair. By dual, I mean that the colonial society was not one united society. It was a society with different communities that probably shared more differences than common points, at least at the legal level. So, except in British dominions, the Europeans were always a small minority. In India, at the end of British India, in the middle of the 20th century, so a bit after the end of this lesson, out of a population of 300 million people in India, so much less than today, the British were only 150,000. So a very, very small minority. And in fact, we would see the same shares, more or less. French Indochina, 20 million Vietnamese, 20 million natives, and only 30,000 French. In French Western Africa, okay, the AOF, Afrique Occidentale Française, in 1914, there were only 2,500 French colonists. All the rest of the population was composed of native African people. And in the island, of Madagascar, 8,000 French for 3 million natives. So, in real numbers and shares, the Europeans were clearly outnumbered, but in the legal system, and also the economic and social system, consequently, the Europeans dominated, because natives and Europeans never had the same rights. And basically the pattern was that the whites were citizens and the natives were subjects. And this was imposed by discriminatory legal systems. In other words, a system of law which imposed a discrimination, that is to say, that was making a difference in rights between the natives and the Europeans. And as an example, I want to speak about the French legal system, which in 1887 was spread to all French colonies and which is known as le Code de l'indigénat. Indigénat est une référence au terme indigène, qui était le terme que les Français utilisaient pour désigner les natifs, qu'on appelle native en anglais. The origins of this code was in Algeria. In Algeria, in 1870, a decree of the government known as the Crémieux Decree, after the name of the minister, gave citizenship to all the Europeans living in Algeria, including people that were coming from Spain or Italy. And the French, of course, but not to the Muslims. Strangely enough, citizenship was given to the Jews as well, the Jews of North Africa. And that was the basis of discrimination. Then in 1881, the Code de l'Indigénat was created in Algeria and applied to all colonies in 1887. And without getting into too much detail, what is clear is that Code de l'Indigénat imposed an inferior status for the natives in matters of civil and political rights. For example, meetings of more than 25 men were not allowed. You could not organize a meeting, and certainly not a political meeting. the natives did not have the same freedom of movement as the Europeans. You had to carry your passport just to travel inside a colony if you were a native, when on the contrary, the French colonizers were free in their movements. There were also huge discriminations in the access to property. In fact, in almost all colonies, the best land on the coastline, or the best lands for farming, were the property of European people, because that was what the Western law imposed. Okay, and in fact, the Western law, the law of Britain, the law of France, could overtake the old rules that were present on the territory, and so the game was totally unfair, because the Europeans were richer, even though all of them were far from being rich. I mean, even inside the European communities, you had a few very rich people, and most colonists which were really working class. But they had the right for them. They had the law on their side. Here is a text which is a text in French that condemns le Code de l'Indigénat. Donc, j'en lis quelques extraits en français avec vous. C'est un journaliste qui se permet, c'était une des rares voix probablement, de critiquer le Code de l'Indigénat en 1919. Et il disait « L'indigénat, qu'est-ce donc ? C'est un système répressif exorbitant du droit commun, qui sous couleur de discipline frappe l'indigène dans sa liberté. Dans sa fortune, il organise la dépossession continue de leurs terres, dans ses droits les plus essentiels. Un arrêté du gouverneur général, armé sur ce point d'un pouvoir discrétionnaire, peut arracher un indigène à sa famille, à sa tribu, le déporter dans de véritables bagnes, ou simplement lui imposer une résidence déterminée, avec interdiction d'en sortir. Mais le pouvoir administratif est également muni d'autres armes. On croit rêver quand on pense qu'aujourd'hui encore, un indigène musulman ne peut circuler en Algérie sans passeport régulier. Pour punir des méfaits de ce genre, des peines de police, amendes, emprisonnement sont prononcées légalement. Un semblable état des choses a créé dans l'âme indigène des sentiments de rancune tenace, d'hostilité sournoise. Il n'a pas peu contribué à creuser entre nous et nos sujets indigènes un fossé de malentendus et de défiance qui va s'élargissant chaque jour. So that discrimination was with some diversity present in almost all colonies of Britain or of France. An illustration of this basically brutal attitude of the European power towards the native can be seen on this photograph. It illustrates the fact that in this code, I'm speaking about for the French Empire, punishments for the natives were much more violent than punishments for the Europeans. And the number of actions done by the natives that were considered to be criminal was much larger as well. So I think there is no better proof, or at least, if not a proof, an illustration of the fact that in colonialism the natives were treated like children than this picture here that shows a type of punishment that was implemented by the French authorities in Indochina, in Vietnam. All the natives were not as badly treated as on the photograph before. In fact, in the colonial societies, the Europeans always followed the rule that an elite of the natives had to be preserved and had to collaborate with the authorities. These societies were not egalitarian before the Europeans arrived. And societies in Europe were also greatly divided between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the dominated ones. But when the Europeans arrived, they were facing societies which had their leaders. And often the best strategy was not to confront these leaders and fight them, but the best strategy was to collaborate with them and have them collaborate with you. And on the side of the native elite, maybe the thinking was that if you could not beat the colonizers, you had to join them. That's a famous English phrase. If you can't beat them, join them. And here, to illustrate that, I am showing to you, it's a bit paradoxical, but I'm showing to you two photographs of two political leaders that would be leaders of the struggle for independence of India. It's Gandhi, who is now an extremely famous historical figure, and Ali Jinnah, who was another leader of the nationalist movement in India, but he was the leader of the Muslims when Gandhi was a Hindu leader. These two religions were present in India. This is how they are remembered by history. But these pictures were taken at the end of their lives, when they were really the new leaders of independent India. When they were young, this is what they looked like. When they were young, they studied in British universities and became lawyers, because they belonged to social categories in India which were really privileged and who had access even to British university. They both went to Oxford. Okay, so they were good examples of these elites that the Europeans wanted to have on their side. In a way, it was the old strategy of divide and rule. Okay, if you give the same bad treatment to all the population you want to dominate, it's impossible. But if you divide them, you can rule. Of course, in the end, it stopped working at one point, but because India fought for its independence. But in the beginning, it worked, and that was an essential element of the political domination of European powers in the colonies. The cities were very important places. Okay, the pattern was basically that, except for the activity of farming, where you could have some European property owners with a great importance, colonial power was based in cities. And in these cities, a real segregation, which means separation, could be seen. The natives and the Europeans did not live in the same districts. When the Europeans were in great minority, like in Indochina, for example, the district of the Europeans in the city was very small. But even in a white settlement colony like Algeria, you can see here in the city of Algiers that a European city existed, mostly along the coastline, and in the background, near the mountains, you can see smaller houses that correspond to the Muslim city, the traditional Arabic city called the Kasbah, where living conditions were much more difficult and the way of life much more traditional and poverty much greater. Cities were also so the place where European power could show itself through monuments, administrative buildings in districts which really look like France or Britain, but in the colony. We can take the example of Saigon with this map and those pictures that show how the city center of Saigon was conceived and structured like a European city, with a cathedral, with schools, with administrative building, a theater, etc., that aimed to introduce the European cultural model and impose it to the people. I like this picture of a square, a public square, in the center of Saigon, because if you look at the building and the way it is it is yeah, organized. It looks like a square in any middle-sized French city. And if you look at the people who live there, they are Asian. So that was what colonial cities were like. This segregation was the rule in white settlement colonies in Algeria, or for the British Empire in South Africa, with a terrible historical impact later. Segregation, so separation, was the rule. In simple colonies where Europeans were very, very few, mixed couples composed of a European husband and a native wife was extremely frequent because European women were very few. So that was a little bit different. But in any case, colonization was based on a legal system of governance whose foundation was racial discrimination. Different rights for the whites, Europeans, and the natives on the other side. And even though in France and Britain the historical trend of the 19th century had been a process towards a higher level of equality among citizens, at home I mean, in France, in Britain, we studied that in the previous lesson. In the colonies, the Europeans had almost an aristocratic status, even though all Europeans were not rich. But they all had privileges. It's as if, for the French Republic, it's clearer, while they were making democracy at home, they were imposing a kind of ancien régime in the colonies. Okay, so that's a paradox. The last point is a question, but the answer will be pretty obvious, you'll see. It's mostly about, the economic development of the colonies. Well, was it really a development, or was it purely an exploitation? If we start with the question of state action in what we would call human development today, so health and education, we can only see that human development action was low. It was already low at home, by the way. Education and health were not public services as strong as they are nowadays in France or Britain. But the figures and facts that we can observe in the colonies prove that the mission of civilization was much more a propaganda topic than a reality. So about education, at a time when free compulsory school was only emerging in Europe, well, in the colonies, the percentage of school attendance of the native was incredibly low. Look at these figures for Algeria. When in France, by 1911, the percentage of children that were scholarized, that went to school, was 95%. In Algeria, for the Europeans, it was only 80%, but for the Muslims, it was less than 4%. Okay, and so that was greatly a myth, the mission of civilization. It was never implemented into something real and something valuable. The figure that I also like to give is the figure that in French Africa, on the whole, 15% of children attended school in 1957. Okay, so really at the end of colonization, only 15% in the middle of the 20th century. So before World War I, it was extremely low. In healthcare, it's true that some epidemics were a bit fought thanks to the introduction of vaccination against some tropical diseases. But apart from this, of course, the healthcare was extremely low for the natives. It was also low for the Europeans. even at home either. And most of these actions were taken by religious missionaries. So perhaps in the end, Christianization was probably the most important cultural impact in the spreading of Western civilization, at least in Africa and Latin America. It was much less true in Asia, where local religions survived. But of course, today we cannot see this as an element of development, more as a kind of what we would call acculturation, which means that the local cultures were destroyed and replaced to a certain extent by European cultures. With hindsight, it's the spreading of the French and British languages, and also, even if it's less important, of British sports, for example, in British colonies, that are the most long-lasting cultural impacts of colonialism. And that's the reason why in India and Pakistan today cricket is extremely popular, or rugby is extremely popular in Australia and New Zealand, and football is extremely popular in Jamaica, for example. But let's talk about economy. In economy, one rule was essential. Profits had to outweigh the costs. Colonization had to be economically profitable. Otherwise, why go on the other side of the world? So before the 20th century, investments remained very limited, except in colonies of white settlement and also in India, where you had a rather dense network of railways, for example, that was built. In fact, India in 1918 had the fourth largest railway system in the world. But the goal of the British was mostly a question of governance. India was too big not to have a railway system. If the railway system had not existed, then India would have been impossible to govern. Apart from that, investments were low. The reason was that to be profitable, investments had to be in only very limited sectors, and everything had to be done to have the economic activities economically productive. So the consequence of that is that in Africa and Eastern Asia, the economy imposed by the Europeans was mostly an economy of pillage. That is to say that the natural resources of Africa or Eastern Asia were almost purely and simply taken by the Europeans and taken by force. And it was almost only based on retrieving raw materials. Like, for example, the wood and the rubber in the French Congo. And private companies had almost total autonomy in order to exploit these resources. They often had their own private military force, and thanks to this force, they imposed forced labor. You may remember that abolition of slavery was often an argument presented by the colonizers. We will go to Africa and we will abolish slavery. Possible. But they imposed forced labor, which meant that the Africans were paid, well, not with great wages, obviously, but they were not free. They were not free to choose where they had to work and how long they had to work. That's what you call forced labor. And this is how the forest of Congo started to be exploited, for example. Okay. Labor laws were almost absent. Children were working. Forced labor was notably used to build railway lines, but in most colonies there was only one railway line, the one connecting the harbor to the zones of exploitation, because it was created, the railway, not to transport travelers, but to transport products. Some commercial farming was introduced, with sometimes modern techniques, but they mostly concern the production of what we call cash crops. That is to say, crops that had a financial value and had to be exported to Britain or France. Though in Africa, that was coffee or cotton, as illustrated on this picture here. In Indochina, rice, wood and rubber. And in India, tea and cotton. By the way, tea was introduced in India by the British. Originally, tea was in China. And so the most fertile lands were in the hands of the colonizers. And this often disturbed traditional agriculture. The traditional farmers in Africa or in Asia had to abandon the best lands to European property owners. And what was produced there was not to feed the people. It was to make money and to be sold on the European markets. And by the way, on the other hand, the economic interest of the colonies was also to serve the colonial powers' industry. It meant that the empires should become a market for the national industries, but not a competitor. So, for example, the British colonies were a market for the British textile industry. Okay? And consequently, the textile industry was not developed in the colonies because it would have been an unfair competition for the industries in Britain. People were cheaper. So this was true, in particular in France, in the French Empire, which was very protectionist. In the French colonies, there were huge tariffs, which means taxes on imports, that were imposed on non-French products. By contrast, the British colonies were more using free trade. That was more the British way. But in any case, industrialization remained very limited. And so the proof of that is that when colonies became independent in the middle of the 20th century, they had only a very, very, very small modern industry. Which leads me to this question in the end of that part C. Was colonization really a curse for the overseas territories? It is a question that has raised major debates among historians and the education system, and that was true for France just as for Britain. That debate is largely a political one. You understand that 1 century ago, teachers in school were teaching that colonization was great. That was the official syllabus. And you would be surprised to understand that this was still the case sometimes even after independence. That was true in France, even though I believe that in France the critical view on colonialism was taught in school rather quickly from the 70s. Less true in Britain, probably. I think in Britain the views on the colonial past even today is not as negative as in France. Why? Well, first of all, probably because reality was maybe different. The British colonies were known to be less repressive against the natives than other colonies of Europe. The biggest contrast is, for example, with Belgian Congo. Today, historians know that Belgian Congo was probably the colony where European violence was the highest. For example, amputation of workers, which is clearly an act of cruelty, was a widely used system of punishment in order to terrorize the other workers. Some historians say that even inside Africa, for example, the British colonies were kind of attractive to migrants from other colonies because living conditions were less oppressive there. So okay, maybe the British colonies were not as violent as the other ones. I think it's also because historians, and I'm notably thinking of an historian called Niall Ferguson, who was extremely successful during the last 20 years, were not very critical of colonialism. And the education system shows not to be too much critical as well. It's maybe changing these days. In my opinion, to talk about a very recent event, which is the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol. Colston was this slave trader whose statue was at the center of the largest square in Bristol, and it was toppled by Black Lives Matters protesters in June 2020. Not starting because the wave has started earlier, but well, you know that we are in June 2020, and there is a huge pressure in many European countries for the removal of statues of so-called heroes of colonization under popular pressure. I think it's a proof that criticism against the way colonization is being taught in school and still talked about in Britain or France, but mostly in Britain, is something that is now largely criticized. Conclusion. Conclusion to this lesson needs to be a little bit detailed. And so in the conclusion, I think it's important to try and answer the question about the common points and the differences between the French and the British empires. Let's examine this question of differences. Well, the first thing that I think must be said is that by 1914, at the end of our lesson, the British Empire clearly outweighed the French one and all the others. The British Empire, when World War I broke out, was 33 million square kilometers big and hosted 400 million inhabitants. That was India that made all the difference. By contrast, the French Empire was 10 million square kilometers and inhabited by 48 million people only. The German one, just for comparison, 3 million square kilometers, 18 million inhabitants. Were the British and French model different? Well, it's often said that the British model of colonization was a bit more liberal, a bit more based on the idea of association, more respectful of local cultures and trade, but not really on the idea of changing the mentalities of the people at the local level. That's probably partly true. What is true is that the process of giving some autonomy to colonies was something much more advanced in the British Empire than in the French one when World War I started, even though it mostly concerned colonies of white settlement. For this reason, I think we can say that British rule was still essentially racist, because Britain believed self-government could not really be granted to non-European communities. Another difference is that Britain invested much more than France in its empire before World War I. The French model applied to a different, a less advanced empire anyway, officially promoted an ambition of assimilation of the natives, which meant the goal of merging the natives into the French culture and progressively introduce French citizenship, but in the future. Well, this assimilation was never really implemented, and particularly not in the political and legal fields. So I don't know, maybe French colonization was even more hypocritical than British colonization, I would say. In both cases, the building of colonial empires was part of the process by which France and Britain became major world powers, and that reached a peak during World War I, when these empires played a role in the victory of France and Britain against Germany. Why they claimed they were not acting, they were acting not only for power, but in order to fulfill a mission of civilization. France and Britain both built societies based on the system of racial discrimination at all levels. Even though small groups of natives could benefit from a limited social rise by collaborating with the colonial power in the pattern of indirect rule. Only British colonies of white settlement benefited from this transition to self-government. As colonialism had to remain a profitable experience for the colonial power, investments in human development, already not very ambitious at home, were extremely limited in the colonies. Investments mostly targeted primary industries, so retrieving raw materials like minerals or rubber or wood, and producing cash crops. Transport systems only aimed to permit this economic activity, maybe with the exception of India. And so my last word would be that colonization deeply impacted the world. It is a political opinion to answer the question, was it good or bad? I will only end with one fact. When the colonies finally obtained independence, and for most of them it was in the 1950s and 1960s, their level of economic development was far behind that of their former metropole. This is the truth.